They called it hell on earth. 8 miles of volcanic ash and sulfur, fortified by 16 miles of tunnels carved into rock by 21,000 men who had sworn never to surrender. The Americans expected 5 days. It took 36. But on the second morning of that nightmare, February 20th, 1945, something emerged from the smoke and cordite that would change everything. 8 machines that carried fire itself. Weapons so secret that even most Marines did not know they existed. And when they roared to life at 14:20 hours that afternoon, the Japanese defenders who had withstood naval bombardment, aerial assault, and massed infantry charges experienced something their training had never prepared them for. Something that would break the unbreakable and make men who had vowed to die at their posts run screaming into open ground. This is the story of how American ingenuity turned the tide at Iwo Jima, and why those who witnessed it would never forget the day fire came to the island. The Sherman tanks rolling off the landing ships on February 19th looked unremarkable at first glance. 30 tons of welded steel, tracks chewing through black volcanic sand, turrets swiveling as they maneuvered inland from the beaches. But 8 of these vehicles were different, profoundly different. Where the standard medium tank M4A3 carried a 75mm main gun capable of punching through armor at 1,000 yards, these 8 carried something else entirely. The CB-H-1 flamethrower system, a weapon that could project napalm-thickened burning fuel across 150 yards of open ground, turning fortified positions into crematoriums and making the air itself a weapon. The men who designed this system had worked in absolute secrecy at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. Army engineers, Marine Corps liaison officers, and Navy construction battalion specialists gathered in unmarked workshops, combining captured German flame projector mechanisms with British pressurization concepts and American industrial manufacturing capacity. They studied reports from the European theater where flame weapons had proven effective in close combat. They examined Japanese flamethrower designs recovered from previous island battles. They calculated fuel viscosity, ignition temperatures, propellant pressures, and effective range parameters. And they built something unprecedented. The CB-H-1 system integrated directly into the tank's fire control mechanisms. The commander could aim and fire the flamethrower using the same sighting equipment employed for the main gun. The pressurized fuel system delivered consistent range and accuracy that earlier portable flamethrowers could never achieve. The napalm mixture burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, adhering to surfaces and penetrating any opening larger than a fist. Most critically, the system carried enough fuel for sustained engagement rather than the brief bursts possible with infantry portable models. These were not experimental prototypes rushed into combat. They were precision-engineered weapons built specifically to solve an impossible problem. That problem had a name: Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a career officer who had studied in the United States during the 1920s, who understood American industrial capacity and tactical doctrine better than perhaps any other Japanese commander in the Pacific. When ordered to defend Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi abandoned conventional defensive strategy. He did not fortify the beaches. He did not rely on banzai charges or suicidal counterattacks. Instead, he transformed the entire island into a death trap, engineered with mathematical precision. His engineers carved the underground fortress over 8 months. Tunnels connected reinforced bunkers, artillery positions, mortar pits, and machine gun nests in an interlocking network designed to survive any bombardment. Positions were sited for overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any advance would come under attack from multiple angles simultaneously. Ventilation shafts allowed defenders to remain underground during preparatory bombardments, emerging only when assault troops appeared. Food, water, and ammunition were stockpiled in chambers deep enough to withstand direct hits from battleship guns. Kuribayashi personally inspected every major fortification, ensuring that his 21,000 defenders occupied the most lethal defensive position in military history. American planners anticipated 5 days. Intelligence assessments projected that overwhelming firepower would shatter Japanese resistance quickly. 3 days of naval bombardment preceded the landing. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers poured thousands of tons of high explosive onto an island barely 8 square miles in total area. Carrier aircraft struck suspected strongpoints with bombs and rockets. The island disappeared beneath smoke and flame. Surely nothing could survive such punishment. But when the first wave of Marines hit the beaches on February 19th, they discovered the terrible truth. The bombardment had accomplished almost nothing. The defenders had remained underground, protected by layers of volcanic rock and reinforced concrete. As assault troops pushed inland from the landing zones, they entered carefully prepared kill zones where machine guns, mortars, and artillery could engage them from concealed positions. Advance became measured in yards rather than miles. Casualties mounted with horrifying speed. The carefully calculated timetables disintegrated. By nightfall on the first day, the beachhead was secure but shallow. Thousands of Marines occupied positions barely 500 yards inland. Medical stations overflowed with wounded. Ammunition expenditure far exceeded projections. The realization settled over the command structure like a shroud. This would not be over quickly. Every yard would cost blood. Every fortified position would require direct assault. And the Japanese had hundreds of such positions, all mutually supporting, all designed to exact maximum casualties. The Flamethrower tanks came ashore on the second day as part of the planned reinforcement schedule, but their presence remained classified. Even most unit commanders did not know about the CBH-1 system. The tanks dispersed among conventional Shermans, indistinguishable except to those who knew what to look for. Their crews had trained for months in Hawaii, practicing the specific tactics required for close-range flame projection. They understood the weapon's capabilities and limitations. They knew the fuel consumption rates, the effective engagement envelope, the vulnerability to enemy fire while stationary. Most importantly, they understood that they were about to introduce something entirely new to this particular battlefield. Something that would either prove revolutionary or catastrophically ineffective. The first engagement came at 14:20 hours on February 20th. Intelligence had identified a cluster of reinforced pillboxes northeast of the initial beachhead that had stopped multiple infantry assaults. Machine gun positions built into natural rock formations with interlocking fire lanes. Mortar teams in covered pits that could drop rounds on any approach route, all connected by tunnels allowing defenders to shift positions or evacuate under fire. Conventional artillery had failed to neutralize the position. Infantry assaults had been repulsed with severe casualties. The decision was made to commit the flame tanks. Tank 431 approached the target area with a platoon of conventional Shermans providing overwatch and a company of infantry following at 50-yard intervals. The Japanese defenders opened fire at approximately 300 yards, small arms rounds sparking off armor plate. The tank commander identified the primary pillbox through his optics. A reinforced concrete structure partially embedded in volcanic rock, with a narrow firing slit oriented to cover the most likely avenue of approach. The kind of position that would require sustained bombardment or satchel charges delivered by infantry willing to die to get close enough. The flame tank closed to 120 yards, rotated the turret to bring the CBH-1 projector to bear, and fired. The napalm stream arced across the distance in a brilliant incandescent ribbon, not the brief burst of earlier flamethrowers, but a sustained torrent of burning fuel propelled by pressurized nitrogen at velocities that turned it into a liquid projectile. The stream struck the pillbox aperture and flowed inside like water finding a crack. What happened next occurred in seconds, but would be remembered by every witness for the rest of their lives. Flame erupted from every opening in the fortification, firing slits, ventilation shafts, tunnel entrances, gaps in the stonework. The structure became a furnace. Men inside had three choices, all fatal: burn where they stood, attempt to escape through flame-filled tunnels, or flee into open ground where supporting weapons could cut them down. Those who ran emerged as living torches, collapsing within steps. Those who remained died without ever being seen. The temperature inside that pillbox exceeded anything compatible with human survival within 30 seconds of the initial flame strike. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Japanese soldiers in adjacent positions witnessed their comrades immolated by a weapon they had never encountered. Training emphasized standing fast, maintaining position, accepting death at one's post. But that training assumed conventional weapons. Bullets could be evaded. Artillery could be survived in deep enough cover. Even direct tank fire might spare those in properly constructed fortifications. But fire that flowed like liquid, that penetrated any gap, that filled enclosed spaces with superheated combustion products and turned bunkers into ovens. Fire offered no possibility of survival and no honorable way to resist. Tank 431 engaged 6 separate positions over the next 40 minutes, methodically burning out each fortification in sequence. The other 7 flame tanks deployed across the front, targeting strongpoints that had resisted conventional assault. Infantry adapted quickly to the new weapon, maintaining safe distances to avoid backblast and heat, but following close enough to occupy positions immediately after flame strikes. The tactics evolved in real time. Indirect approaches to minimize exposure, corkscrew maneuvers to bring the projector to bear from unexpected angles, sustained burns to ensure complete suppression rather than brief bursts that might leave survivors. By nightfall on the 20th, the tactical situation had fundamentally changed. Strongpoints that had held for 2 days fell within minutes of flame tank engagement. Advance rates increased measurably. Japanese resistance remained fierce, but the mathematical certainty of mutual support began to fracture. Defenders could no longer assume that holding their assigned positions would allow them to inflict casualties indefinitely. The calculus of defensive warfare had shifted. General Kuribayashi recognized the threat immediately. Reports reached his command post describing the new weapon and its effects. He issued orders emphasizing deeper fortification, more circuitous tunnel systems, enhanced ventilation to prevent flame penetration. But the underground network, while extensive, had been designed based on known American weapons and tactics. The flame tanks introduced a variable that could not be easily countered. Positions that had seemed impregnable became death traps when fire found the interconnected passages. The logistics of sustaining flame tank operations strained supply systems to their limits. Each tank consumed hundreds of gallons of fuel mixture per engagement. Resupply required moving thousands of gallons daily from beach supply dumps to forward positions under constant artillery and mortar fire. Specialized handling procedures were necessary because napalm-thickened fuel could not be pumped through standard equipment. Refueling operations left tanks vulnerable and required infantry security. Yet despite these challenges, the operational tempo increased. Commanders who had initially viewed the flame tanks with skepticism requested their support for every major assault. The Japanese response evolved as the battle progressed. Some units attempted to engage the flame tanks at longer ranges before the CBH-1 could be brought to bear. Anti-tank guns targeted the vehicles during approach, exploiting the fact that flame tanks could not return fire effectively beyond 150 yards. Defenders experimented with rapid evacuation when flame tanks appeared, abandoning positions temporarily and attempting to reoccupy them after the tanks moved on. But these adaptations could not overcome the fundamental vulnerability. Fortifications designed to survive bombardment became indefensible when fire could flow through them like water through a sieve. The psychological dimension manifested in unexpected ways. Japanese troops who had witnessed flame tank attacks began surrendering, something virtually unheard of in Pacific combat up to that point. Not in large numbers initially, but individuals and small groups who concluded that remaining at their posts guaranteed death by immolation. Interrogation of these prisoners revealed the profound terror the weapon inspired. They described the sound of the projector, a roaring hiss unlike any other weapon. The way flame seemed to hunt for them through tunnel systems, following air currents and seeking any space with oxygen. The knowledge that armor plate and reinforced concrete meant nothing against a weapon that simply flowed around barriers. American casualties decreased measurably when flame tank support was available. Infantry assaulting unsupported positions still suffered grievous losses, but attacks preceded by flame strikes achieved objectives with dramatically fewer killed and wounded. The reduction was not total. Snipers, mortars, and isolated strongpoints continued to exact their toll. Terrain remained treacherous, volcanic ash collapsing under weight, sulfur fumes making breathing difficult, rain turning the ground into adhesive mud. The battle's overall brutality did not diminish, but the flame tanks introduced an element of operational flexibility that had been entirely absent during the initial assault. The 8 original vehicles were not invulnerable. Enemy fire damaged several, requiring field repairs and parts cannibalization. Fuel system malfunctions occurred, sometimes at critical moments. Volcanic terrain proved challenging for tracked vehicles, limiting mobility in certain sectors. One tank was disabled by a buried naval mine, the crew surviving but the vehicle beyond field repair. Yet despite attrition, the remaining flame tanks continued operations throughout the battle, adapted and maintained by crews who understood the weapon's strategic value. By early March, as the battle entered its 3rd week, the tactical revolution was complete. Marine Corps Doctrine had fundamentally incorporated flame tank employment. Standard assault procedure now included flame support whenever possible. Infantry tactics evolved to maximize the weapon's effectiveness, with rifle squads trained to identify suitable targets and coordinate with tank commanders. Artillery and air support integrated flame tank operations into fire plans, using conventional weapons to suppress anti-tank defenses, while the flame vehicles maneuvered. General Kuribayashi's fortress, brilliantly conceived and executed, could not withstand the combination of American material superiority and tactical adaptation. The underground network that should have held for months fractured under sustained pressure. Supply lines to forward positions were severed. Isolated strongpoints fought on, but coordination deteriorated. The northern sectors, honeycombed with the most elaborate fortifications, fell to combined arms assaults where flame tanks burned out positions that conventional weapons could only suppress temporarily. The final organized resistance collapsed in mid-March. Kuribayashi himself died during the last defensive actions, leading a final attack rather than enduring capture. Scattered defenders continued fighting from isolated positions for weeks afterward, some not surrendering until months later when starvation made further resistance impossible. But the battle's outcome had been determined by innovations like the CB-H1 flamethrower as much as by numerical superiority. Casualties told the story in stark mathematics. Nearly 7,000 Americans killed, almost 20,000 wounded. Japanese losses approached total annihilation, 20,000 dead from a garrison of 21,000. The butcher's bill for 8 square miles of volcanic rock exceeded the worst projections. Yet intelligence assessments conducted after the battle concluded that without the flame tanks, casualties would have been significantly higher. The weapon that seemed to embody humanity's most primal terror had, paradoxically, saved lives by making continued resistance untenable. The flame tanks themselves became objects of study and controversy. Their effectiveness was undeniable, measured in destroyed fortifications, reduced casualties, and accelerated advance rates. Combat reports documented hundreds of pillboxes, bunkers, and cave positions neutralized by flame when other weapons had failed. Yet the weapon's nature troubled even those who deployed it. Burning men to death in enclosed spaces violated something fundamental in human psychology. The screams of those caught in the flames carried across battlefields, audible even over artillery. Some crew members requested transfers after extended exposure to the weapon's effects. Military analysts recognized that Iwo Jima represented a watershed. The CB-H1 system and its successors would influence armored vehicle design and infantry tactics for decades. Subsequent operations in the Pacific incorporated flame tanks from the planning stage rather than as specialized assets. The weapon's psychological impact became a factor in operational calculations, not merely its destructive capacity. Cold War Doctrine studied the Iwo Jima engagements as examples of how technological innovation could overcome prepared defenses. The legacy extended beyond hardware and tactics. The battle demonstrated that even the most meticulously prepared defenses remained vulnerable to unexpected innovations. It proved that static fortifications, no matter how sophisticated, could not guarantee success against an enemy willing to adapt and innovate. It showed that victory in modern warfare required not only courage and material resources, but the intellectual flexibility to recognize when established methods had failed and new approaches were necessary. For the Marines who fought there, Iwo Jima remained the defining experience of their service. The black sand beaches, the sulfur stench, the grinding advance measured in yards per day. And for those who witnessed the flame tanks, the memory of those machines rolling forward with fire streaming from their turrets, the way fortifications that had seemed impregnable simply ceased to exist when touched by that incandescent stream. Some viewed the weapon with grim satisfaction, seeing it as justice for comrades lost to defenders who refused surrender. Others saw it as necessary evil, effective but troubling. None forgot it. The 8 tanks that came ashore on February 20th had been built in secrecy, deployed in uncertainty, and employed with devastating effect. They represented American industrial capacity, scientific innovation, and tactical adaptation compressed into 30 tons of steel and flame. They had not won the battle alone. Artillery, air power, naval gunfire, and above all the courage of infantrymen advancing into fire had been equally essential. But they had changed the battle's mathematics at a critical moment, breaking defensive positions that might otherwise have held for weeks longer. The story of Iwo Jima is often told through iconic images. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, captured in a photograph that would define an era. The landing craft approaching beaches under fire. the wounded being evacuated while fighting continued around them. But there is another image, less celebrated but equally significant. A Sherman tank with an unusual turret configuration approaching a fortified position. A stream of brilliant flame arcing across volcanic ash, and a strongpoint that had resisted every previous assault suddenly falling silent, smoke rising from openings that moments before had been spitting machine gun fire. That image represents something profound about warfare and human ingenuity. The capacity to identify problems that seem insoluble and engineer solutions that change the fundamental parameters. The willingness to take risks on unproven technology when conventional methods have failed. The ability to adapt doctrine and tactics in real time based on battlefield results. These are the qualities that won at Iwo Jima as surely as courage and firepower. The flame tanks that shocked Japanese defenders on that February morning in 1945 were more than weapons. They were proof that technological innovation could overcome even the most formidable defenses when combined with tactical skill and operational courage. They demonstrated that the course of battle could shift based on tools that did not exist months earlier. They showed that victory required not just fighting harder but thinking differently. And they left a legacy that extended far beyond that volcanic island in the Pacific. The lessons learned at Iwo Jima influenced armor development, infantry tactics, and combined arms doctrine for generations. The terrible effectiveness of flame weapons in enclosed spaces shaped bunker design and defensive planning. The psychological impact of weapons that offered no possibility of survival became a factor in military psychology studies. The logistical challenges of supporting specialized weapons informed supply chain planning. But perhaps most importantly, the flame tanks of Iwo Jima demonstrated a fundamental truth about warfare that remains relevant decades later, that no defense is impregnable, that innovation can overcome entrenchment, that the willingness to adapt to risk, to employ new methods when old ones fail, often determines outcomes as much as raw power. That is the real legacy of those 8 machines that rolled into combat on February 20th, and forever changed how modern armies approach fortified positions. The battle ended on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of continuous combat. The island was secured, though individual holdouts would continue fighting for months. The strategic objective, airfields to support the bombing campaign against Japan, had been achieved. The human cost had been catastrophic, but the tactical lessons, particularly regarding flame weapons, would influence military thinking for decades to come. So what do you think? When faced with an enemy determined to fight to the last man from positions designed to be impregnable, was the use of weapons like the flamethrower tank a necessary innovation or something darker? Does technological superiority in warfare represent progress or simply new ways to achieve ancient brutality? If you found this story compelling, subscribe to hear more forgotten chapters of military history. Leave a like if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered. And share your thoughts in the comments about whether innovation in warfare saves lives or simply changes how they are lost. Because the questions raised on Iwo Jima remain unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable, even 80 years later.